This is chapter 26 entitled Grace and Grandeur, the Baroque Dance Suite. So in the Baroque era, instruments were greatly improved and featured in several large-scale genres, including the suite, a collection of dances, old print word. Incidentally, right, the Baroque is, to remind you, 1600 to 1750. What happened in 1600? Yes, the invention of opera. And what happened in 1750? A few things. One of them was the death of J.S. Bach. Now, I've mentioned this before, but in reference to modern versus early music in those terms, after 1600 is considered modern because then we have modern instruments, and it's not like it's just they turned off the old and they, applied the new. It didn't work like that. Over a period of several hundred years, we get into modern instruments, but mainly the violin family is started to be used around this time. And you'll see that there's transitional music and instruments being used, and both that are older instruments and early music instruments and modern instruments. And of course, the second thing is standard tuning is applied after 1600 to equal temperament, we call it, where they used a mathematical comparison of the pitches to make it so that you could play in all of the keys on the piano and it would sound equally good and not start to sound bad because you're using black keys. And the third thing is the use of major and minor scales, because before the 1600, the Renaissance and the Middle Ages used, we call them church modes, and or it's modal music, and it's may have some major and minor that we can compare it to, but typically it's not necessarily major or minor. So after the modern, after 1600, we say it's modern music because of three things: modern instruments, standard tuning, and the use of major minor scales. So the suite, and I like to say that a suite is a collection because it's like when you go to a hotel or motel and you say, I want a suite, it's like a suite that's more than one room. So it's not just one thing, it's multiple. And it turns out to be, it's a multi-movement work, although it's not part of the multi-movement cycle that we talk about in the classical period. The Baroque suite is a group of dances, usually in the same key. We'll talk about this, with each piece in binary form. And you would look at it as A, B, B. You play that A section and repeat it. And you play the B section and repeat it. Or it could be in ternary form, A, B, A. And we're going to sample music by George Frederick Handel. Two of his suites, he wrote more than two, and we call them orchestral suites because they're written for orchestra, because you can have a suite that's for a solo instrument or a small group of instruments or up to orchestra and full orchestra. And we're going to sample music from his suites called Water Music. And later he wrote a very popular suite called Music for the Royal Fireworks. So regarding to Baroque instruments and how they changed from the Renaissance, well, it's a combination of, which comes first, the people able to play or the craftsmen that make instruments that are capable of greater things, and then musicians are able to use it and put it in force. The thing about the strings is the viols, which look like a violin, were used in the Renaissance. And the viol, the big difference between the viol and the violin family is the violin family has a post, a sound post that is wedged between the top of the violin and the back of the violin. So when the strings are vibrated, it goes through the bridge to the top of the violin and then through the sound post to the back of the violin. So both the front and the back of the violin vibrate, which in turn is made it's a lot louder. And we have instrument makers that Stradivarius, Guarneri, and Amati in northern Italy, in Cremona, I believe is where they made these instruments. And it's like, why are they so valuable today? Millions of dollars for these instruments, and they have such a great sound. And they're not really sure, but they do know that the wood that they used for these violins was moved down a river, so it was soaked in water for a period of time, and then it was treated with borax, which was a treatment to protect worms, bugs from eating in the wood. And if it wasn't, wood would be destroyed in a period of years. So we're not sure if it was because of the water, because of the borax, or because of the varnish they used, but it's curious that all these instruments had to be rebuilt for modern standards because they used gut strings, which don't require as much tension. So now we use metal strings on violins, and it requires a lot greater tension. So there's a lot more force on the top of the violin, and they had to be rebuilt, basically taken apart and reassembled. And so they're not the same instruments that they were made by the original maker. And brass instruments, then, we're still using natural instruments, and you've seen me mention this and point this out in different pictures where the instruments don't have valves, so it has one length of tubing, and it's much more difficult to play different notes because you have to use the mathematics is as far as the changing the length of the tubing, right, by 1/2, 1/3, etc., and the harmonic series, basically. It says recent interest in authenticity. There is certainly that, and lots of times there are recordings made where they use original instruments, and that's kind of special. So if you're going to buy a recording, you might look for that. Here is a painting, 1575, 1642, and they're commenting that how much you can learn by looking at a painting, because you see the instrument and you see that it doesn't have the neck piece, and the person is playing it and they're holding the bow differently than we would now, and holding the instrument differently than we would now. So it's not about the painting, it's about musicology and learning how they played that instrument that's different than we do now. Here is a picture, and it refers to an evening outdoor concert. And you can see the instruments here on this makeshift stage, and the audience around. Harpsichord in the center, and there are woodwinds and trumpets. And that's the way they might have done it. Remember, in another chapter on instrumental music, on the stylized dance, we talked about indoor and outdoor instruments. So the Baroque suite, again, that term suite, is a group of dances, and they are all in the same key. And at this time, the Baroque period is very international, and there's an attempt to be very distinct when you are German and writing German music, or French music, or Spanish music. And so in the suite is a mixture of nationalities. You have these dances, right, stylized dances. You might have a German dance with an allemande, a French dance with a courant, a Spanish dance with a sarabande, an English dance, a gigue, and you might have minuets or gavottes, barrets, passapites, hornpipes. Different types of dances are, many different types of dances are used, and you don't have to use any particular group. And of course, if it's binary, it looks like this. If it's ternary, it looks like that. And again, it could be written for solo instrument, or for chamber ensembles, or orchestra. So frequently the first movement is either a prelude or an overture or a fantasia, and those are prelude and fantasies are kind of improvisatory in nature. And just as far as a reference, what is a French overture, right? It's characterized by these sweeping scales, slow plodding tempo, and dotted long short rhythms. Dun, da-dun, dee-ding, da-dun, dee-dun, da-dun. And then a lot of imitative polyphony. Again, dances could be for cello or solo violin or solo lute. Sometimes they were called partitas as opposed to suites, basically the same thing. Or for orchestra, well, they're called an orchestral suite. Ballet dancing in France was really popular for the king and the court. So music was written for dancing, and then so some of these dances were used to make into orchestral movements of the orchestral suites. So again, this Baroque era dance music, again, the term stylized, where they borrow the characteristics of the dance that was originally danced to, and then make it into a concert piece. Homophonic, what does that mean? One melodic element and everything else to support that. But there is also polyphony, especially if it's a gigue, is very polyphonic. Again, you could have an allemande from Germany, a courante from France, sarabande from Spain, minuet from France, a bourrée from France, gigue, English gigue, and a Siciliano Italian dance. And they all had specific characteristics, and you can look up and find out and see illustrations of how to dance these dances. So again, this is a schematic for binary form, right? We would show the A section and with the repeats and the B section repeated. Here is a sample of actual suites. Like this is a Bach lute suite. He wrote 4 lute suites, and this is number 996. But it starts with a prelude. Remember, that's not a dance. And then there's an allemande, German dance, courante, a sarabande, a bourrée, and a gigue. And these are all in binary form, and they are dances. Here is the movements from Bach's cello suite number 1. He wrote 6 solo cello suites. Again, it starts with a prelude, and then you have these dances all in binary form, except the minuet. Well, that's a binary form, but oftentimes the way this would be done, you'd have the minuet 1, and then you'd play a minuet 2, and then you play minuet 1 again. So we say that all of this turns out to be A, B, A. But each minuet is in binary form, actually. A side note, what's a trio sonata, and how many instruments in a trio sonata? Kind of a quick trick questions, right? Because it's written for 2 soprano instruments and 1 bass instrument, but actually 2 soprano instruments and continuo. Remember, continuo has a bass instrument and a quarto instrument. So there are actually 4 instruments in a trio sonata, 2 melody instruments and the continuo, which is 2 instruments, a bass instrument and a quarto instrument. Here's a picture, yay, of this man here, right? A royal sortie on the Thames River in London, similar to the water music party is depicted, and we'll talk about that. But look at this number of boats on the river, and this big boat here with a lot of passengers, sailboats, rowboats. So this big boat is propelled with oarsmen. And the London River, at least parts of it, when the tide is rising, the river goes one way, and then when the tide is receding, it's going down, then the water goes that way. So if you are clever, you can get in, know when the tide is rising, and it's much easier to go upstream as opposed when it's not high tide or the tide is not rising. So, and this is really neat, right? This is published in the London Daily Current 2 days after this occurred, July 17, 1717, all those sevens, right? And here they're reporting, and the capitalization is as it was printed originally. On Wednesday evening at about 8, the king took water at Whitehall in an open barge. And you can look at that picture in your mind, and this is the description is applies to that picture, that painting. So it took water, meaning that he got on the water. And Whitehall is a suburb of London now, right? He went up the river towards Chelsea, and that's still there. Many other barges with persons of quality attended, and so great a number of boats that the whole river in a manner was covered. A city company's barge was employed for the music, wherein were 50 instruments of all sorts, who played all the way up from Lambeth, the finest symphonies composed express for this occasion by Mr. Handel. And they're using this word symphonies in a loose way, which His Majesty, the King, liked so well that he caused it to be played over 3 times in going and returning. So the boats traveled up to the destination, and he got off the boat and for an hour or so, and then got back on the boat and then went back. And he wanted music in both directions. So here, Handel, 1685, 1759, born the same year as Bach. Remember, Bach died in 1750, which we say is the end of the Baroque. And he has 2 really famous suites that are called Water Music, and the other is called Music for the Royal Fireworks. It says the Water Music is 5 movements, but actually there are 3 suites, and I'm not sure exactly how that fell into place, but so we're going to sample the movement called a la hornpipe, right? And it's actually in ternary form. So here I'm showing you the actual movements of these suites by Handel. Here is the Water Music suites. And so we're going to listen to a la hornpipe. It's from this second one. Here you have this HWV number, which you often see in Handel's music. It's a reference to how the music was cataloged. So this suite, right, starts with an overture, and then there's a slow section, and then we have a minuet, an air, a minuet, bourrée. Some of these are dances, and some of them are not. And so we're going to sample the a la hornpipe from this suite, and these 3 are called Water Music suites. And his royal, and this is from 1717, the Royal Fireworks suite was written in 1749. A different king was in power at that time. But again, you see the dances. The Water Music suite, showing that it has Allegro, a la hornpipe, minuet, lentement, and bourrée. So the Allegro is an overture, and we're going to listen to the second movement. Very elegant music. Let's enjoy it. ABA form, and the A section, that melody is repeated a number of times, and then the B section, listen for it. It's in minor, and so it's contrast, and then we come back to the A section again. Incidentally, hornpipe must have been quite a popular piece of a dance at that time. If you recall, when we studied opera and we listened to Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, we listened to the one section from the opera, which was a hornpipe, where the sailors on deck were waking up and they did a hornpipe. Okay, so that will conclude chapter 26, George Frederick Handel and the Suite.